Now, preview time.
Welcome to Look, Look and Look Again in this two-parter concerning the series Survivors. So in the second part of this two-parter we're going to have a look at seasons 2 and 3, which ran from 1976 to 1977. Despite success with a viewing public, things were not that settled behind the scenes of the programme Survivors. Terry Nation and Terence Dudley often clashed and argued about which direction the show should be taking, and on how they wanted the series to evolve. Things came to a head, and after the first season, Terry Nation jumped ship, leaving Terence Dudley a free rein on the production and a sole vision for the survivors. Whether Terence Dudley was a bit of a bugger, truth be known, is unsure. If you recall, it was Dudley who also clashed with Kit Pedler and Jerry Davis when he was involved with the series Doomwatch, resulting in a big shake-up when they were pissed off enough to leave after the first series. Another major change to the show was the departure of Carolyn Seymour, who played Abby Grant, who was written out of the first series to continue her long quest to find her son Peter. Behind the scenes, Seymour readily admits that there was no love lost between her and the producer Dudley right from the get-go. However, despite this, the changes did not impair the series in terms of popularity. Viewing figures actually increased, and Survivors gained a pretty big following with the public because of it. With one of the leading triumvirate gone, Dudley recast Dennis Leal to reprise his role with the character of Charles Vaughan, who joined forces and buddied up with Greg Preston. Ian McCulloch got on very well with Dennis Leal, but was a little bit peeved when he found out he had to share the male lead limelight with another, and was also starting to miss the dynamics between himself and Carolyn Seymour. One of the disappointing things about Series 2 was the character of Jenny, who during this series was sidelined and relegated to just looking after the children throughout the duration of the season, in complete contrast to her prominent position and gutsiness witnessed in the opening series. Jenny also began to get a little bit whiny during the season. However, all is not lost as Jenny bounces back in Season 3, but more on that in a moment. Season 2 also saw the introduction of new characters. One in particular, and one of my favourites, was the character of Ruth Anderson, played by the gorgeous Celia Gregory. Ruth was paramount to the community during Series 2 and into Series 3 due to her knowledge and expertise in things medical. Perfect for a world plunged into and regressing to an almost medieval mindset. Such was Ruth's importance, and one of the Series 2 highlights, the episode, the epic two-parter, The Lights of London. She is kidnapped, and it is up to Greg and Charles to mount their trusty steeds and rescue her, facing the apocalyptic perils of urbanization rather than the bucolic setting, which, despite it being hostile, was more affable, an environment for the people our heroes to exist in. So, although that the countryside was perilous enough, when it moved to the city of London, it offered new hostilities and dangers, making for some gripping drama. Disappointingly, The character of Ruth started out as a strong lead in Series 2, but fades out a bit. It became more of a character behind the scenes towards the end of this particular season. There were other casualties for Season 2, and what better way to start this off than bump off some of the characters in one foul swoop. And in the Season 2 opening episode, an inferno decimates the community at the Grange, and also in the process got rid of some of the characters the producer felt superfluous to the series. This also added dramatic impact to the opener when the Grange burned out shell. The survivors relocate to Pastors New and seek sanctuary in Charles Vaughan's settlement at an isolated hilltop community called Whitecross. Greg and Charles often chest-beated who was in overall charge during this series. A new matriarch entered the foray called Pet Simpson, a kind, brave and highly compassionate individual brought to life by the talented actress Lorna Lewis. Pet added a little stability and made an admirable surrogate for Abby, but less tormented in her character. After the character of Tom Price had exited and bowed out, this role went to grumpy troublemaker Hubert Goss, who took over as a substitute and also took over the mantle, played by superbly by John Aberneri. Unlike the character of Tom Price, Hubert Goss goes from hobo to hero, and a proper hero at that, by the end of Season 3. Hubert is cantankerous to start with, and the way he stirs up hysteria in the community is against a herbalist called Mina, is one of the highlights also of Series 2 in the underrated episode called The Witch. Season 2 focused on mainly humanistic elements and aimed predominantly at highlighting the complexity of the human condition under such adversity. The community at Whitecross is represented better, in my opinion, here in Season 2 than the Grange was in Season 1, and focused more in depth also on the self-sufficiency role in this series and the processes involved in everything from how charcoal is made right down to the creation of gas from cow shit. Although this does dent the flow of the mise-en-scene slightly, and to a modern-day audience this may be slightly sluggish, but in no way compromises the verite of the programme. Season 2 focuses more on conversation and dialogue, which on occasion outstays its welcome. In Series 2 there is more emphasis on debate and whether dependence on the old world or pure self-sufficiency of the new is a better one or worse, and this is debated a great deal in this season. Due to this, there are a few clashes with the main protagonists, Charles and Greg, as both each represent the new world versus the industrial ways and technological ways of the old. This paves way for some excellent scripted standoffs between the two of them. Unlike Survivor's first season, the second series does seem a little less foreboding than the first was in terms of its grim atmospherics. Although both series start in the bluey heart of winter and ends up on an optimistic, if not highly uncertain future, Season 2's ambience seems slightly more settled. Perhaps this is due to Dudley's wish for the programme, where he wanted it to go more down a anthropological route. Overall, Season 2 had some excellent episodes, but I did notice that when I first saw this series towards the end of it, I did get a bit sort of like fidgety because of the ploddingness. Although the acting is good, although that's of a very high caliber standard, and although that you get to know and love the characters, this series does seem to, Series 2, just doesn't seem to have the gravitas as the first one, and things do start to wane. Before the third series went into production, Ian McCulloch expressed his concerns about what he perceived to be an inferior standard in scripts, and therefore he decided to call it a day. McCulloch requested that his character of Greg Preston be entirely written out of the show, and in Series 3 also had an attempt at writing some of the stories himself. And arguably these episodes that he penned could be considered the strongest episodes in the last season. For its third season, Survivors decided to branch out beyond the White Cross community to see what's happening in a bigger sphere, and to spread the gospel of Greg Preston, who at the end of Season 2 had gone to Norway with fellow engineers in a balloon. Greg returns, and much of the series has Charles, Hubert and Jenny going in search of him, only to find in the varied communities they come across, Greg has already been there already and left. By now, audiences had adjusted to no Abby Grant, and would also have to get used to, in Season 3, the lack of Greg Preston's presence, as Ian McCulloch became a kind of guest star of the last series, which I thought was a good touch, as the actor wanted to wrap up his role and didn't selfishly abandon it. The last series also saw the breakup of the White Cross community, which had something to do with Dudley, as he felt that the community itself, despite its ups and downs, had become rather too introspective, and the ordeal here was to branch out to bring many varied situations to plunge the triumvirate into without the backing of familiarity. Civilization was now beginning to look as though it was on the eve of being rebuilt with a renewed optimism. The first part of Season 3 concerned the hunt for Greg, now returned from Norway, and establishing where he was in the country as Greg spreads the word of the Norwegian plan to rebuild humanity. The second part was Charles Vaughan's perseverance of uniting communities to trade, establish trade routes, and relying on barter, as well as supporting Greg's gospel. As he, Jenny, and Hubert travelled from community to community. At Season 3's conclusion, it sees Charles investing in a plan of his own as he progresses to the Scottish Highlands and works with a community in charge of possible hydroelectric power that he firmly believes will be the genesis of a new dawn, which wraps it up rather nicely. You would have thought the variety of communities would provide enough scope for decent adventures, but I found this to be a wholly fragmented affair, which finds you sticking with the show's duration solely how to see how it's going to conclude and wind down. It seems by now, by Season 3 of Survivors, that the lustre had rubbed off, and it probably was a good enough time to end the series. The main three protagonists are not being supported by a regular, familial group of fellow community mainstays, but by an ever-changing group associated with different settlements. The 15-minute duration is not enough to get to know the crux of these characters, and alas, in some cases, a few become instantly forgettable. Due to the charisma of the guest stars such as Ian Cuthbertson, Brian Blessed and Barbara Lott, to name but a few, on occasion it seems the three leads do take a step backwards to the proceedings, where they are always needed in the forefront. Despite its misgivings in Season 3, one positive thing is that Jenny finally, after a whole series of whinge and nurture in Series 2, comes into her own again and goes full circle. Jenny not only has to come to terms with the realization she has lost Greg, she also has to come to terms with the insecurity of being away from the White Cross community. Jenny joins Charles and Hubert in his travelling entourage and has to rely on her guile and self-ingenuity once again in quite a few episodes. In some episodes, Jenny goes it alone in completely foreign terrain when the plot needs. This makes her character once again a lot more three-dimensional and more rounded. Jenny also finds her voice again and becomes a decent enough foil for Charles Vaughan's headstrong ways, and after Greg disappears, who else could she spar and debate with? The ratings for Season 3 also waned significantly, and the audiences at the time were, as per the appreciation statistics, also beginning to dwindle. The thought of our wandering hero stumbling from community to community sounded an exciting prospect in idea, but somehow didn't translate too well onto the screen. Season 3 looked rather weary as the landscapes where the stories were set. It is true that the third series does get back to being more darker and grittier and more akin to the first series than the season it followed on from, but this third stint sadly lacks the stability and ultimately seems fractured, veering very near to it being rather a messy little affair on the whole. This, I believe, is due to the quality of the scripts and, it has to be said, the plot redundant leads. When you don't have leaders, or they become just another group of characters, and they go to the background rather than being the forefront, this does pale things significantly in comparison. In contempt of this, though, Season 3 does sport some pretty decent nuggets of drama. One of the episodes, Mad Dog, definitely springs to mind as it deals with the subject matter of rabies, as well as what happens to Greg in the episode called Last Laugh. And on hindsight, the final episode, Power, is enlightening and would appeal to millennials everywhere nowadays because it is all happy. Happy joy, which after 3 years of murder, mayhem, misery and mud and disease is possibly the best way to end the show, although personally I would have preferred something in a more darker vein, but that's just me being morbid and a pessimist. Survivors was and still remains a bastion of that golden age of television that people were lucky to experience first time around when, at the time, the licence fee payer paid to be entertained by a corporation that was not reluctant in putting out things from the norm and safe. It beggars belief that with only 3 channels at the time, just how diverse it was, and yet with all this choice that we have now, and as constantly told is good for us by the marketing moguls, we can see that quantity is not necessarily quality, as we don't have to produce some shit nowadays. Survivors also proved to be a decent enough cash cow when it was flogged abroad, being exported to countries like New Zealand, Canada, USA, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, and of course, as we mentioned previously, was well appreciated on a vast level in Italy, which ultimately, as we've mentioned before, springboarded Ian McCulloch's career into some spaghetti splatter. Survivors also spawned 2 novels. Survivors in 1976, which was written by Terry Nation and entwined the first 4 stories of the television programmes, which would have been a godsend to fans of the show as video machines were in their infancy and only the very rich could afford them, a bit like what Target novelisations did for Doctor Who. Nation, not restricted by budget, went for bigger and grander things in the novelisation, and this also ended Abby's story as she is finally reunited with her son Peter. However, there is a twist. Survivor's Genesis of a Hero was published in 1977 and was a spin-off, as it saw the tribulations of Abby's son as he tries to survive in a dystopian post-plague world, but this novel proves a lot more bloodier and violent than the programme of which it is based. The setting here has the dystopia much more militaristic and totalitarian than what we had been viewing, and is a decent enough read, it has to be said. How did I meet with the survivors? Well, I shall tell you. It was all down to that wonderful UK satellite TV station called UK Gold, which when they first started was an absolute treasure trove of cult programming. UK Gold broadcast on satellite TV on the channel, Survivors, Doctor Who, right from William Hartnell up to the McCoy stories, The Changes, Doomwatch or Rent-A-Ghost episodes of Top of the Pops were screened nightly, and this was absolute heaven to me. Also, the channel put out some gems that were lesser known. I recall watching such fare as the Lotus Eaters, mainly because it had Wanda Ventham in it, and of course the Aphrodite Inheritance. The early 1990s were a retro heaven in our house. I remember those times so very fondly. You could also get Bravo, another satellite television, which at the time was showing all of the Avengers, including the uber-rare Kathy Gale episodes, as well as of Randall and Hopkirk Deceased, Strange Report, and Sapphire and Steel, and Space 1999. To be alive in this age for a pure retro head was a dream. So on a Saturday, I was hooked on the show and saw all 3 series as they were broadcast. UK Gold did show all the episodes, but some were cut and censored for timing reasons. Those fucking ad breaks. Or they were censored due to their violent content. Doomwatch was also a victim of this as well. But despite this, it gave a deprived UK audience the opportunity to watch what they could only read about in sort of like retro nostalgia magazines. So this is in no way a complaint. I was hooked right from the start to the end, but as said, my viewing did wane a bit as we got to the end of Season 2, beginning of Season 3. Since then, the BBC released the show on VHS video cassettes and then on DVD, and due to this, has generated a new legion of fans for the show. In 2008, Survivors made a comeback by the BBC and ran for 2 seasons. Oddly, there was a year-long gap, as the second season didn't get screened until 2010. The last episode paved way for a 3rd season, but alas, due to poor ratings, the series was cancelled. To be honest, it wasn't half bad and quite watchable. It is a bit of a shame it was never given the opportunity to develop further or conclude nicely. The series put a rather peculiar and somewhat predictable spin on the original by moving heroes into the adversary roles and vice versa, and the rather predictable token ethnic hero for fear of offending and diversity washing. However, as far as I'm concerned, there is only one true Survivor series, and that remains firmly with the 1970s version of Armageddon, and in some aspects, if you replace a virus with zombies, you could get something that tenuously could be a cousin of this show. Survivors is definitely worth a binge watch, and in some areas I suppose you could say that Survivors is admittedly a product of its time, but some of the topics still show prescience today, and such gems as this programme, as others on Look, Look and Look Again, must never be forgotten for their foresight, dexterity, and overall generally a triumph.
You're a maniac! It's rabies!